Hey, gunfighters. So this originally aired on Alpha Male Podcast, and I hope there's a lot of crossover, but I don't think everybody that listens to Gunfighter Life listens to Alpha Male, just going off the numbers. So I'm going to put this out. Instead of Attack Reload episode of Gunfighter Life, you'll get this episode that originally aired on Alpha Male. It's about weapons in general, so I think it's fitting for the podcast. And don't forget about Alpha Male Podcast if you don't generally listen to that. Hello, and welcome to Alpha Male Podcast, the podcast where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values. For we are made in the very image and likeness of God. Strong, dominant, in control. We don't apologize for that. Today's episode came out of a Patreon voting block. You see, I'll sometimes put out different ideas for episodes and the patrons will vote on them. This one, by a landslide, got it, which kind of surprised me, to be honest. And it came from my observation from my other job. Why are men not armed? Like, why is such a vast majority of the population not armed? Even in a state where it's constitutional carry, where it's about as free as a state can get, there's still a bunch of men just walking around unarmed. And they got me to wondering why. And I've got some ideas, some theories. And that, again, by a landslide, won the vote. And I sometimes get some pushback, and this episode is not for that, but a quick synopsis on why I think there is no contradiction on being armed and being a Christian. Jesus is God made flesh. Right? We probably don't disagree in that fundamental Christian doctrine if you're a Christian. Ergo, he has all the attributes of God. He is fully God. It is written, Exodus 15, the Lord is a man of war. God has wrath. He is rich in mercy. And he has many attributes, but the Bible says he is rich in mercy, and I say amen to that, and I'm very thankful for that. But he also has wrath. And we see Jesus in Revelation, the wrath of the Lamb, when the people are crying to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the wrath of the Lamb. Jesus was on a mission. He fulfilled that mission, thankfully for all of us in our salvation. He was meek in that mission, meaning he had his power under control. But that doesn't mean he doesn't possess wrath. We see in Revelation the Lamb, Jesus, returning with wrath. And there are many other theological rabbit holes we could go down. This is not the episode for that. I just wanted to hash it out before we got to that. You should do your own deep dive. You should not take my word for that. You should read the Bible for yourself on that. You should not take any other person's word on that. You should dive into that for yourself. But to put it pretty clearly in relation to today's episode, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells his disciples, let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. With that, I'm going to put in a real quick rapid fire bio, the shortest one that I have pre-recorded, just so you know, if this is your first episode, why you're listening, why you should pay attention, why you should care what I have to say. I think that's important. Blessed to have served in the military, law enforcement, combat veteran, private contractor, competition shooter, lifelong hunter, guide. Blessed by God that he got me through all those things so I could share this firsthand training, knowledge, experience with you to serve you today. Let's dive into the podcast. So, if you guys don't know, I went back recently to being a private contractor, being a gun for hire, basically, for who doesn't really matter. But in that, I interact with what I would call a lot of everyday people. And it struck me how many grown men are not armed in our society. And this, we're talking about a free part of the country. as free as you can get, I think, in America still. So one of the reasons I chose a job and want to live in this part of America. I'm talking like the Wild West area, what I deem the Wild West. Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Utah, that kind of area. And it's about as easy to carry about any practical weapon that you want, handgun, knife, whatever, here. And still, so many men in the population aren't. They just go around unhealed all day. They just go around walking around without a weapon, which astounds me, but apparently I'm the weird one because most people walk around unarmed. I do a whole other show, Gunfighter Life, and I think I might actually put this episode out on Gunfighter Life because I don't think that everybody there listens to this podcast. So I'll probably put this out dually. Also because, to be honest, I'm working 2 jobs and I don't have a lot of time to record as much new content as I used to. But I think it's important. So we're not going to get into, what kind of guns or any of that. That's not what this is about. It's about just any gun, any knife in general. Why aren't more men armed? And we could sit here and debate about the numbers, how many men, what percentage have concealed carry, even in states where you don't need it. A lot of people that carry get them. It just makes life a little bit easier. But it's a very small percentage. So in a society where you can be armed, where it's so easy, and many of you listening probably live in states or countries where you don't, and you would love to have that ability. So why in a place where it's so easy and so free of regulation and infringement, why do so many men still not walk around armed? That's what we're kind of going to discuss today, and kind of my thoughts on that. Number 1 that we're going to discuss is passivity, being passive. Now, let me be clear, we talked about in a Christian context, and I don't think that one has to be armed to be a Christian. You can be a better Christian than me and not be armed, I think. There is no contradiction in being armed and being a Christian, and I don't think there's any contradiction between being passive and being a Christian. So I think that's a legit reason. Some men are pacifists, and I'm not going to sit here and bash that if that's their actual conviction. I find that far more acceptable than many of the other answers we're going to talk about today, but they're pacifists. They're like, even if somebody is beating my wife's head into the pavement until she cracks her skull and dies, I'm not going to do anything. I'm a pacifist. That ain't me. Probably not you, but there is, I think, a very small minority that are legit pacifists. Like, no matter what, they would not use force on another human being. They've made that choice. I'm not here to argue whether that's their calling or not. I think you can be a Christian pacifist. I think you can be a Christian warrior. I don't think any of those negates Christ's effects on your life, but a pacifist. Another one is they're untrained and they know it, which is probably better than people that aren't trained and think that they're good to go. But they're untrained and they know it. They have no experience with weapons. Maybe they've never been in a violent encounter in their life. They've never been punched in the face. They've never punched anybody in the face. It's not a world that I live in, that I'm from. But many men, I think, fall into that camp. And they have no idea how to wield violence. So therefore, they shy away from it. They're not a pacifist. They understand that violence is sometimes necessary. But they just have no experience with violence. They just grew up in a world where there was no violence, or they weren't. That's not true. They grew up in a world where they were shielded from the violence, and they weren't exposed to it at all, and they have no idea how to wield violence. They have no idea what to do. They have no idea how to wield a weapon. They have no idea how to even throw a punch. And I think that is a not insignificant portion of men today in 2024 in the Western world, in America at least. Here is another big one. Fear. Fear is a big one. Many men are afraid of violence. They're afraid to use violence. They're probably, if that's the case, afraid that violence will be used on them. They just are afraid, so they shy away from it. They fear what they don't know. Or they fear the weapon itself. Hoplophobia, that's a thing. Fear of weapons, fear of guns. A lot of people have an irrational fear of guns. Now, firearms, just like a knife or anything, any other weapon, they should be respected because they are potentially deadly weapons. I'm not talking about a respect for an object for the capabilities that it has. Rather, I'm talking about an irrational fear of weapons. Hoplophobia. It's a term. It's a term because it actually exists. Some people have an irrational fear of weapons. Some people have it specifically for guns. Some people have it for pretty much any weapon. But fear in general, fear of violence, but fear of weapons specifically. Hoplophobia is a thing. Some people are just irrationally afraid of weapons. Like some people are irrationally afraid of spiders. You could sit there and tell them, that spider doesn't bite. That spider will never bite you. In fact, you probably want that spider hanging out outside your house because it's going to eat mosquitoes and flies and things like that. And you could show them in a book, like this spider is 100% not even able to bite you. Not deadly, not poisonous, not venomous. Venomous is the correct term, but let's not get nitpicky. That spider is 100% not dangerous. Can't even bite you, not even going to hurt. And they're still afraid of the spider because they have an irrational fear of spiders. There's a rational fear of spiders. Like I'm not going to go sit there, flicking a black widow in the face. I'll give that thing the due respect and responsibility handling it garners. But I'm not irrationally afraid of it. I'm not afraid of a black widow if it's 5 feet away because I know it's not going to do anything to me. But so, again, some people are irrationally afraid of weapons, hoplophobia. That's probably also a small minority. But I think a real thing and worth throwing in there. The next ones I'm going to kind of tie in together, but lazy. Lazy. They're lazy men. These are men who recognize that the world can be a violent place. Like bad things can happen to all kinds of people. And they're not pacifists. They're not even averse to using violence, not even afraid of weapons. But they're just like, I don't feel like it. I would rather, watch whatever sports ball team and I would rather go out and spend my money on a jersey of that color. And that's what I want to do with my time and my energy. Which is nothing wrong with that for leisure. I'm not putting that down, but that they don't care about it. They're maybe not even lazy in general, but lazy in regard to that thing. Or they're unwilling. Like they're like, yeah, I know, it probably would be better for myself, my family, society as a whole if I were trained and armed, but I'm unwilling to do it. Maybe if somebody paid for me to go to training or somebody, bought me a gun and 1,000 rounds of ammo and sent me to training, then I would go because I'm not averse to it, but I'm unwilling to do it for myself. I'm unwilling to dedicate any resources, time, money, mental energy, physical effort to this problem. Lazy, unwilling. I don't know what that percentage is, but it's probably higher than some of the other things we've talked about so far. The next one, uncaring. And this is distinctly different from unwilling. Uncaring is they just don't care. They're indifferent. They're like, yeah, being armed, not a bad thing. I'm not averse to weapons. I'm not afraid of weapons. I see a value in firearms and training for a citizen, but I just don't care. If something bad happens to somebody else, I just don't care. If a woman gets beat to death in front of me, I don't care. If I see a child getting abducted, I don't care. It's not even my deal. There are people like that. They're just indifferent to other people's problems. They don't care enough. They don't even really care if it happens to them. Like, I'll deal with it then. I don't want to care about it now. They don't even want to care about it. They're too busy climbing the corporate ladder. They're too busy chasing women around. They're too busy with their sports ball teams. They're too busy, binging something on Netflix. They don't care. This, I think, sadly, is probably the biggest category of men. They just don't care. And I'm guessing here, but they don't care. They would rather devote their time and energy to something else. It's somebody else's problem. Oh, we'll call the police. They'll be here in 15 minutes. If they don't handle it, not my problem. I just don't care enough. And I think sadly that is a big chunk of men today. Again, they're so consumed with bread and circuses that being armed is just not something they care about. Putting the effort, the time, the dedication into it, the training, They just, to be well regulated. They don't care. And I think sadly that is a big chunk of this. I think just, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a sociologist. You heard my background. I'm just a dude that sat there last week and thought about this at work. But just from looking around in society, what do you think? Like, this is a great episode for comments. If you're listening on Spotify, there's a thing on there to ask me questions. Well, let me hear your comments of what you think. But I think that's a big part of it. They just don't care. Another one that's maybe not as big, but also I think significant. When I was a police officer, I heard this a lot, and I'm going to deem it the "I never thought it would happen to me" fallacy. People, are the victim of a crime, and you hear, "I never thought it would happen to me." I heard it so much as a cop, I'm going to be honest, I became jaded to it. Like, I'll use it something not in relation at all to weapons. Like, there would be BFMVs, burglary from motor vehicles, all up and down their neighborhood, like people's cars getting broken into, windows getting smashed, stuff getting stolen, and you go to a report and they're like, "Well, I never thought it would happen." Even if it's something that happens in their neighborhood and they're aware that it happens in their neighborhood. Like, "Well, I never thought it would happen to me," as if somehow they were immune to crime. As if somehow they had some kind of crime prescription and they just took it and there would never be any crime committed against them. The "I never thought it would happen to me" fallacy. They just don't even want to think about it. Just, "I never thought it would happen to me." I think that's a lot of people, because it sounds kind of ridiculous, but I heard it so much as a cop. "Well, I never thought it would happen to me." In regards to like weapons, and I'm not carrying a weapon, one thing you hear is like, "Oh, I just won't go to places where I need a gun." Well, you had better never go home then, because home is where a lot of crime is committed. Look at the statistics on burglaries and home invasions, and look at what a home invasion is. Look at the number of those versus house fires. They happen. They happen a lot. But still people think, "Oh, I never thought it would happen to me." You're not going to go anywhere where you might need a gun. You better never go home. You better never go to church. You better never go to the gas station. When you think about it, it's kind of ridiculous, but people will say that. Maybe they don't actually believe it, but I think a lot of people actually do. They just have this "I never thought it would happen to me" fallacy, which is what likely many people thought right up until the time they got murdered. Because everybody that ever got murdered, every day before that, they never got murdered before. It never happened to them before. You can only get murdered once. Unless there's some weird happenstance coincidence, everybody who's ever been the victim of a violent mass shooting, it never happened to them any day before that. It only happened that day. It only has to happen once. So, but I think that is a significant chunk, and I don't know what that chunk is, but the "I never thought it would happen to me" fallacy crowd. They're just denial. I never thought it would happen to me. Just somehow they have some kind of prescription to protect them against crime. And there is another one that I thought of that is a legit reason why, and not everybody should be armed. I was asked that when I went on another podcast, and do you think all men should be armed? And no, I don't think all men should be armed. And here's a reason for that, and this is a minority, but it's a legitimate minority worth discussing. One, physical impairments. If somebody's blind, deaf, and dumb, they probably don't need to be walking around with a handgun. They have the right to, yes. Should they exercise that right? No, because they don't have the ability. Right? So some people have impairments that would hinder them from that, mental, physical. And the example I use in this podcast that I'll use again is some men are suicidal. Some women are suicidal. Some people go through a season of that. Depression. I'm a veteran. Many veterans suffer with suicide. Suicidal tendencies or suicidal thoughts or whatever, right? If that's you, probably, I'm not saying they don't have the right to, but I'm saying that is a legitimate reason why somebody may not want to be armed. Like none of these other things apply, but they look at it soberly and think, worse for me to have a gun than not have a gun. And that's a real thing. Again, I don't think every man should be armed. So there are legit reasons. I think the first one we talked about, if you're a legit pacifist, that's not me, but if that's you, if you're a legit pacifist, like if you're the guy that like would watch somebody get their head beat into the pavement and not do anything violent to that other person, I'm not gonna put that down. That's just not me. Or this last category, a mental, physical thing where you look at it soberly and say it's worse for me to be armed than unarmed. Those are legit. But think about this, men, as it pertains to you or people that you know closely and love, your circle. Are you armed? Are you armed on a daily basis? If not, which one of these categories applies to you? And is that legit? Is that a legitimate reason for you to not be armed? I'm not here to answer that question for you. I would like you to answer that for yourself. Anyway, no tactical tip for the day, a more deep, kind of thoughtful episode. The tactical verse of the day, I'll repeat from the Gospel of Luke. Let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Thanks, and have a blessed day.